homogeneity there. They're incredibly diverse in terms of who they are. So how do I, figure out, what's the composition of people? What makes people people within a state? Really, it comes to citizenship. Citizenship is something that the government confers upon people that unifies them. Because what it does is it gives those people universally certain rights and compels them to certain duties. When you think of citizenship, you ought to think of both. Most of us typically think of the first part of the equation, rights. What am I entitled to? And very rarely do we think about what do I need to give in exchange. Part of what you're doing is citizenship right now, believe it or not. You're trying to get a fundamental understanding of our government so that you can both question it and in doing so hopefully kind of strengthen it. You're looking to become more informed and participate in a more informed way. That's part of citizenship. That's part of the duties. At any rate, most of us think of the rights. Jot it down real quick, flip it over. See, can you think of like 3 rights? 3 things that governments give people? And then see if you can come up with 3 duties that are kind of typical. When you're defining citizenship, like the test is a form to define things, but then illustrate. So if you were writing about citizenship, you'd want to both define it and then illustrate it. That's a formula for writing. What did we come up with? What are some rights? Classic examples of rights that you'd use to illustrate, what makes a citizen a citizen. What kind of things do governments typically guarantee?
Right to protest.
Yeah. So you often see you can go to the Magna Carta and there's this right to petition the king, right? There's this right to kind of bring grievances, to have a voice in the political process. We can kind of expand it.
Freedom of the press.
Yeah, so we're looking more unique at perhaps our amendments, but again, universally there is this freedom of expression, and it includes the press as well as the right to protest. Other rights that you think of when you hear about rights? Classic examples. Give me a trio. A holy trio of rights.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
There you go. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Who do you get it from? John Locke. What was Locke's trio?
Life, liberty, and property.
Property, okay? So life is one that, if we're looking at the most basic level of what a government guarantees, they're not going to arbitrarily take your life without due process. You'll have to have done some sort of violation of the social contract for life to go away. Liberty. By liberty we mean kind of the freedoms of choice that allow you to maximize the quality of your life. Locke talked about property, that being kind of something that was considered fundamental to your security, really. You needed, anything that you own not to be arbitrarily taken away from you. Jefferson expands it, pursuit of happiness, a bigger kind of, more robust definition of the freedom to kind of pursue economic and social opportunities, right? Then you get into the more unique, our Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, on and on it goes. The big question is, how universal are these? Does your right to speech end at the borders? And is it just unique to being American? And tough luck for the others. Or are these kind of universal concepts? Long story short, these rights do vary state to state, and the government is what defines it. And often we'll argue about, well, they should be more universal. But I guess that's a story for another day. Rights are defined by a government, and it's kind of what makes a people a people. It's what unifies them. Duties. What did you come up with?
Taxes.
Yeah. You want certain services, you're going to have to pay for them. This is a pretty universal one. Again, the amount of taxes that people pay are different place to place to place.
Vote.
Yeah. What's interesting is, again, state to state, this might be different. It's considered, you know, an obligation in the United States, but is it mandatory? No. What percentage of people vote in the United States? Anybody know? Presidential election. Take a guess, 0 to 100%. How many?
49.
Right on the money, right around 50%. You know, and if we're not really interested, it dips. Around congressional races where there is no presidential race, we're talking 30 to 40% show up. So what's interesting is it is, you know, we are a representative democracy where the health of our democracy depends on how informed and how active we participate, or the level of our participation is, and it's not particularly robust. There's all kinds of extenuating circumstances, and we'll look at that later, but the right to vote in some places is more of an obligation. They might have penalties if you don't vote, whereas here, you know, it's more considered like a responsibility as opposed to something that's going to be enforced. Any others? What's unique in Israel? What does everybody have to do? Man, woman, you know, men and women.
Sir.
Military service. What do you have to do in the United States? Men, age 18. What do you have to?
Sign up for the draft.
Yeah, you've got to register for the Selective Service. You've got to make sure that, you know, your name is on a list if they ever had to draft people. If they ever had to kind of, you know, pull people into the Army. So duties are, again, something that unifies us. It's what gives us all something in common. There are certain things that we're entitled to, and there's certain things that we've got to give back in exchange for it. Just a stretch. Thought that was a question. All right. What makes a territory a territory? Again, it was a really diverse list. I showed you the Vatican. Not only is the Vatican made up of 1,000 people, but it's like a square mile. It's just a series of city blocks. Let's see if this is open. I'm going to click on it over here. I'm not sure I've got that list still open. All right. I rounded up apparently. You know, the population dropped since this was updated. So I've got, you know, 920 people living in the Vatican, and we're talking a land area of 0.44 square miles. You know, this one is 10 square miles. So if I were to kind of sort this in terms of size, there's some pretty small, you know, territories here. I go all the way to the bottom of my list, and there's China, which is massive, right? And you know, you can look at population density. So again, there's a real diversity to this list. Obviously, the size of territory doesn't matter. What matters is a recognition of that territory. That, you know, those arbitrary lines drawn on the map are recognized. It doesn't matter how big or how small, they just have to be kind of recognized. And again, what that's going to bring us to is just like with government, the most important concept with states, what makes a government and what makes a state is the recognition of their legitimacy, the recognition of their authority. Again, otherwise you're just a person in a tinfoil hat screaming about Martians, right? It's all well and good that you think you're legitimate. If other people don't, it doesn't matter. So how do I define, with the government, how I defined authority was, you know, both an internal and external recognition. But in some level, as long as the people within the country recognize the authority, you've got to function in government. They may not be able to carry out foreign policy, but you've still got to function in government. With the state, it's really dependent on external recognition. Most of my tests that make a state have to deal with external recognition. You know, because otherwise it's kind of subjective. I had mentioned earlier the Palestine and the Palestinian people. For the longest time, they weren't a recognized entity. There was a Palestinian Liberation Organization that continually was saying we're legitimate, but they didn't have a seat at the table at the UN. They weren't included in diplomatic negotiations. They were seen as a group that had used extreme means, and therefore was one that was shunned by the global community. You can go back to the government that conspired with the Nazis in World War II. There was a kind of a shadow government set up. There was the government of France that was conspiring, and a separate government that was trying to remain independent. Taiwan is an interesting kind of example. China sanctions countries that have dealings with Taiwan. Taiwan is a place that tries to be independent economically and politically. So there are places where sovereignty is in question, and what really makes sovereignty is the right to rule independently, by the way. What makes a nation sovereign often is, do other nations engage with you with regards to negotiation and treaties? Can you conduct foreign policy? Can you control your borders? Or do people just simply ignore it and march through them? Are your diplomatic envoys received? Can you send and receive diplomats? That's what makes a state a state. That's what separates it from other political entities. Now, just as a sidebar, you live in, well, actually this is a trick question, I suppose. You live in the United States. There's 50 states. You, however, live in what? Massachusetts is a what? You don't live in a state. Commonwealth. You live in a commonwealth, from puritanical kind of terms, that political territory run for the benefit of all under puritanical rule. No drinking, no dancing, no playing cards, no showy dress, no profane language. Go to the stockades with you. So you live in a commonwealth, and there's 3 other commonwealths, Kentucky and Pennsylvania, I believe. But we're kind of all collectively thought of as states, and that's a misnomer, right? Because if I look at the definition, do we have sovereignty? Is Massachusetts able to send and receive diplomats? Can we print our own money? Can we declare war on Canada? I suppose we can. It's a little crazy, but I suppose we can. It's interesting. Before Deval Patrick had done some diplomatic missions abroad to generate kind of countries that are would invest in and come establish businesses here. But the definition of us as a state is a throwback. We used to be states. We used to be independent political entities. Following the Revolutionary War, during the time period of the Articles of Confederation. Obviously now we've ceded that authority. We've kept some, but we don't conduct foreign policy. We don't necessarily control our borders, nor do we send and receive diplomats. So that's an interesting way to kind of put that test to the test. All right? All right, more terminology. And then we're coming up on our break. Having kind of defined out what a government is and what a state is, the physical structure within which it operates, governments take different forms. What I give you was a generic definition of government. What I want you to begin to be able to do is, crystallize, to kind of, cement your understandings of systems that you've studied in the past, to have that kind of working terminology. It helps to have a system. When we think about government, there's 2 ways of approaching it. We can talk about who holds power, and that's one way to look at a string of different types of government. But we can also think about where power is geographically, and that's a different way of coming at a series of classifications of government. All right? So, picture a conveniently square state. And within that state, I'm thinking about who within that state holds power. Or, within that conveniently square state, I'm thinking about where are my subdivisions? How much have I divided up that state into smaller groups and given those smaller groups, those smaller territories, authority? All right? If I start with who holds power, there are 3 types, and I'm going to kind of cycle through just the headings in blue. And it may be helpful for you to see the shape of it. I've got autocracies, I've got oligarchies, we're going to come back to it, and democracies. Those are the 3 kind of types. Auto means one. Oligarchies is my next